Welcome everyone to the final day of our workshops. I am glad that you are here. My name is Sara Werneke. I am the Tax Incentives Program Coordinator at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. The session will be recorded and taking questions at the end. So before we get to the actual case study, let's just very briefly go over the highlights of what the Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program is. The National Park Service, or NPS, administers the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program with the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and in partnership with the State Historic Preservation Offices, or SHPO. The tax incentives promote the rehabilitation of income-producing historic structures of every period, size, style, and type. Through this program, underutilized or vacant schools, warehouses, factories, retail stores, apartments, hotels, houses, offices, and other buildings throughout the country have been returned to useful life in a manner that maintains their historic character. The Historic Preservation Certification application is a three-part application used to apply for certifications required for federal historic preservation tax incentives. The National Park Service certifies whether a building is a certified historic structure and whether a rehabilitation meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation and is consistent with the historic character of the building and, where applicable, with the district in which it is located. Is a 20% income tax credit for the certified rehabilitation of a certified historic structure at the federal level. And in Oklahoma, we follow the federal process. So once you qualify for the 20% federal credit, you automatically qualify for an additional 20% at the state level for a grand total of 40% dollar for dollar that is taken over the next 5 years after the project is complete. Only depreciable properties can qualify for the tax credits, meaning income-producing properties that are owned and operated by for-profit entities. Now, let's get into the case study, and we will start with some general statistics on the building and the property and the project. This is Lincoln Plaza Inn and Office Buildings, located at 4445 and 4545 North Lincoln Boulevard in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma County. They were all built between 1966 and 1974. The start of the rehabilitation began in February of 2017 and was completed in October of 2021. It was certified as a certified rehab in December of 2021, with the original use being hotel and offices, with the new use being market rate apartments with various amenities. The estimated total project cost was just over $68 million, with the estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures being just shy of $58 million, meaning that the estimated total federal tax credit was about $11.5 million, and that's the same for the state tax credit. The property owner and developer is Tannenbaum Holdings, with a historic preservation consultant as well as an architectural consultants were used. Here are just a couple of comparison photographs. The image on the left is how the property looked circa 1974, and the one on the right is a couple of years after the project was completed in 2023. Here are more comparison photographs. This time, the image on the left is how the building looked in 2018 when the project started 2017, 2018 when the project started, and again, the one on the right is when the project was complete in 2021. So now let's see how we got from a derelict property to a property that building went to live in, utilizing the historic preservation tax credit. And this project started with a Part 1 and a National Register of Historic Places nomination. We use the Part 1 to request certification that a building contributes to the significance of a registered historic district or a National Register property with more than one property and is thus a certified historic structure for the purposes of the 20% rehabilitation tax credit or for easement donation purposes, or use the Part 1 to request a preliminary determination of whether an individual building not yet listed in the National Register of Historic Places might meet the National Register criteria for evaluation of whether a building is a potential historic district in a potential historic district contributes to the significance of that district, or of whether a building outside the period or area of significance of a registered historic district contributes to the significance of that district. If the building is neither within a registered historic district nor individually listed in the National Register, the applicant or owner must submit a Part 1 and begin the separate process of requesting the SHPO to nominate the building or the district to the National Register. Please note that if the building is a single building individually listed in the National Register, it is already a certified historic structure and a Part 1 is not needed. A Part 1 is required for all other properties, including individually listed properties that have more than one building. In this instance, it was not yet listed, so we had to go through the listing process. Since the property was not yet listed to the National Register of Historic Places, the Part 1 was used as the preliminary determination of listing. As such, a draft National Register nomination was prepared and submitted with the Part 1 application. Lucky for us, the information needed for the Part 1 is the same as the information in the National Register nomination, so it's literally a copy and paste. The Part 1 application components comprise of the form, the signature page, the form, the write-up, which contains a description of the physical appearance as it is today and any dates of alterations, and a statement of significance, a draft National Register of Historic Places nomination, and various maps, including boundary comparison maps, Sanborn fire insurance maps, Google Earth images, historic aerials, if available, historic photographs if available, current photographs properly labeled, including that include all buildings within the property, the exterior, the site and context, and the interior, key spaces, rooms, and any significant character defining details. As such, photo keys and space analysis with arrows showing where the photos were taken that correspond with the numbers of the labels need to be on it. And then if applicable, a letter of affidavit from the property owner. If you can find historic photographs of the building, great, but sometimes it can be difficult or they just don't exist. We will need photographs of the building or buildings if there is more than one building on the property, as there was for this project. The few photographs required should show the current condition of the building or buildings, both on the exterior and the interior, and be properly labeled. The typical photograph set amount for a Part 1 application is usually 10 to 20, depending on the complexity of the property. The Part 2 will require additional photographs to document the entirety of the property, so don't worry about providing everything all at once. These can, and typically are, the same photographs that are submitted with the National Register nomination. On occasion, the applicant will not yet own the subject property, and a letter of affidavit from the current property owner must be submitted acknowledging that they are aware of the undertaking and consent to it happening. So this is the part one for the project. It included a fully filled out signature page, or page one, which contains the basic information about the property, including the name of the property, the current address, indication of whether or not the property is currently listed in the National Register, who the project contact is and their information, and who the applicant is and their information. The property name ought to be the historic name of the property or the address if it does not have a specified historic name. The write-up and the subsequent continuation sheets matches what is in the draft National Register nomination submitted with the application and includes a physical description of the property as it was at the beginning of the project before work began. It also describes any known alterations that have occurred over time and their approximate dates. It also includes a statement of significance or historic narrative of the property that explains why the property is significant. Remember that just because something is old doesn't necessarily mean that it is historically significant, and vice versa. Because the property was not yet listed to the National Register of Historic Places when the project started, a draft nomination was prepared and submitted with the Part 1. Again, the draft National Register nomination ought to match the Part 1 application and includes a physical description of the property as it was at the beginning of the project before work began. It also describes any known alterations that have occurred over time and their approximate dates. It also includes a statement of significance or historic narrative of the property that explains why the property is historically significant. The historic preservation consultant prepared the various documents and worked with the National Register of Historic Places program coordinator at the SHPO on the National Register listing and the tax credit program coordinator at the SHPO on the tax credit applications and the process at the same time. Along with the application and nomination, a supplemental information document was put together that compiled the various maps, historic images, and any pertinent news articles for the consideration and comparison. The satellite image on the left shows the property as it was at the beginning of the project. The image in the middle is a copy of a historic aerial that shows what the property looked like as it was in 1941, which was before the development of the property. The image on the right is a historic aerial taken in 1970 after the inn and office buildings were constructed, but before the Southern Trade Market building and parking lots and tennis courts were built. Comparing these various images and resources gives a better idea of the evolution of the development of the property and the area around the property, as evident in the increased development of the surrounding neighborhood. This also helps confirm dates of construction and/or alterations. Historic images and photographs are always a great find, if you can find them. Fortunately for this project, the property was well documented in local newspapers. This meant that there were more historic images and documentation than is typical, which included news articles, artist renderings, and historic photographs of the exterior of the buildings. A set of photographs documenting the current condition of the property before work began was submitted. The photographs were few and just gave a brief overview of the property. In total, there were only 43 photos submitted to document both buildings. Accompanying these printed photographs were photo keys that depicted the site and floor plans with photo tags indicating the location of the photograph was taken and what direction the camera was pointing. Also on this photo key are colors indicating the results of a space analysis describing the level of importance of the various spaces. Lobbies and main circulation spaces are considered primary spaces, shown here in blue, and as such, those spaces need to maintain a higher degree of historic integrity and less alterations. Versus spaces considered secondary, shown here in red, being individual uh, hotel rooms, restrooms, utility rooms, and other support spaces which can support a higher degree of alteration for the new use. The green spaces are indicated as being primary spaces, but less important than the main spaces, and are reserved for secondary circulation and reception areas. Basically, it has to do with what degree the general public has access to. An important aspect of every project is the official correspondence between the applicant or consultant and the SHPO or MPS. This project did not require a letter of affidavit from legal property owner, as the applicant at the time of the initial submittal was the legal property owner. A letter of affidavit is necessary if the applicant is not the legal property owner and acknowledges the proposed undertaking by the applicant slash prospective buyer and that the property owner consents to it. Detailed cover and transmittal letters are important to keep track of what got submitted to whom and when. We now do this via email. So once everything was submitted in a format that was complete and acceptable, the State Historic Preservation Office reviewed the submittal and issued their comments and recommendation to the National Park Service here in pink for their review and official determination and formal letter on the right. The SHPO's recommendation was submitted on December 13th, 2018. And then after a bit of back and forth, the Park Service finally approved the Part 1 on April 16th, 2019. So now that the Part 1 has been approved, let's look at the Part 2, which describes the proposed rehabilitation. Part 2 describes rehabilitation work to be undertaken on the property and must be completed by all applicants seeking the federal income tax credit for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. The Part 2 will not be reviewed by MPS until the Part 1 has been filed and acted upon. Even if you submit the Part 1 and the Part 2 at the same time, unless the property is already individually listed in the National Register, then you do not need a Part 1. Applicants are strongly encouraged to submit applications describing proposed work and to receive approval from MPS prior to the start of work. Owners who undertake rehabilitation projects without prior approval from MPS do so at their own risk. Proposed work will be evaluated using the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation and 36 CFR 67.7. Conformance with the standards will be determined on the basis of the application documentation and other available information by evaluating the property as it existed prior to the start of the rehabilitation work, regardless of when the property becomes or became a certified historic structure. We briefly went over the standards in our presentation yesterday. The standards apply to both the interior and exterior work, and the NPS reviews the entire rehabilitation project, including any attached, adjacent, or related new construction on the property. The standards are applied in a reasonable manner, taking into consideration economic and technical feasibility. Certification is based on whether the overall project meets the standards. To be certified, a rehabilitation project must be determined to be consistent with the historic character of the building and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. The Secretary's standards for rehabilitation take precedence over other regulations and codes in determining whether the rehabilitation project is consistent with the historic character of the property and, where applicable, the district in which it is located. The first page of the form must be the actual official cover sheet, must be filled out in its entirety, bear the applicant's original signature, and must be dated. We are now accepting digital signatures due to the revised submittal process. The other sections on the subsequent pages provided may be expanded as needed or continued in another format like a Word document, just as long as the information required is given. If the statement is submitted with a previous part of the application, a duplicate copy is not required. Send architectural drawings or sketches showing the existing conditions and the proposed rehabilitation work and any new additions or new construction. Include floor plans and, where necessary, sections and elevations. Dimensions and notes must be clearly legible. For small projects, sketches may suffice, and drawings must be numbered and keyed to the application narrative. Send photographs showing the interior and exterior before rehabilitation. Include the building site and environment, all sides of the buildings, all major interior spaces and features, and representative secondary spaces and features, including areas where no work is proposed. Photographs need to be labeled with specific information to include building/property name, view shown, description of view shown, date taken, and photo number. The amount of photos required for the Part 2 will be greater than the amount acceptable for the Part 1, and it will take as many photos as it takes in order to fully document the property. Again, if the applicant is not the fee simple owner of the property or is not the owner at the time of the application within the meaning of the word owner set forth in 36 CFR 67.2, the application must be accompanied by a written statement from the owner indicating that they are aware of the application and have no objection to it. This is the part 2 for the project. Well, it's part of the part 2 for the project. Like the part 1, it included a fully filled out signature page or page 1, which contains the basic information about the property and the project, including the name of the property, the current address, indication of whether or not the property is currently listed, who the project contact is and their information, and who the applicant is and their information. Additional information includes the projected project data, which, among other things, denotes the number of buildings, estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, and existing and proposed uses. On the continuation sheets, each item, feature, material is described separately. First, the item or feature or material that will be discussed is specified, as is the date of said item, feature, or material. Then, the existing condition of the item is described, followed by a description of how it will be addressed during the project, even if no work is proposed. Between the two descriptions, the photograph and drawing sheet numbers of where we can expect to see where the specific item is featured or addressed is given. This trend is continued until every aspect of the project has been discussed. In this case, over it took 49 sections over 26 pages to fully document the proposed project. For the architectural drawings, the bare minimum of drawings that are required are existing and proposed site plan, existing and proposed floor plans, and existing and proposed elevations. Other drawings that are not necessarily required but highly recommended and are frequently asked for by Park Service are existing and proposed building sections, existing and proposed reflected ceiling plans, and proposed mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plans. Here are a few of the existing conditions drawings with the proposed below. Note that in this case, the existing conditions drawings were coupled with the photo key and space analysis. Again, a set of photographs documenting the current condition of the property before work began was submitted. Above is the photo image, and below is the label on the back of the photograph with the name of the property, the address, a brief description of what the photo is showing, who took the photo, the date that the photo was taken, and the direction of the camera was pointing, which part of the photo was submitted with, in this case, part 2, and the photo number that corresponds to its respective tag in the subsequent photo keys. This set of photographs contains a lot more prints and fully documented the buildings that were being worked on. In this case, 119 photos were submitted for the inn building and 116 photos were submitted for the office building. Again, photo keys and space analysis that depicted the site and floor plans with photo tags indicating the location of the photograph was taken and what direction the camera was pointing were submitted. As you can see in these example photos, the buildings were in fair to poor condition. So once everything was submitted in a format that was complete and acceptable, the State Historic Preservation Office reviewed the submittal and issued their comments, recommendation, and recommended conditions to the National Park Service in yellow. The SHPO's recommended conditions covered concerns with the treatment of the exterior wall panels and through-wall TPAC units, entrances, the pool, railings, windows, rooftop mechanicals, MEP systems, and anything else that had yet to be submitted for review. That last one is a blanket condition that virtually every project gets. The SHPO's recommendation was submitted in January 10th, 2019. And please remember that the SHPO's recommendation is just that, a recommendation. Official determinations are only given by the Park Service. So once the Park Service receives the submission from our office, the applicant will receive an invoice from MPS to pay for the review. Please note that the Oklahoma SHPO does not charge for our review, but that is not the case for every state. The National Park Service issued a conditional approval of the Part 2, meaning that the majority of the work was deemed appropriate and consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. But there were some outstanding issues to be resolved. The Park Service's condition was a conditional approval made on April 19th, 2019, but the final conditions were not exactly the same as the SHPO's conditions. The Park Service's conditions included all the conditions that the SHPO had, plus the treatment of the elevator lobbies and the central corridor in the inn building. This is an excellent example of why applicants need to wait for the Park Service's official decision before starting work. Amendments and phase advisory determinations use the same form. Amendments are used for a variety of reasons to amend previously submitted information. Advisory determinations are used to close out and get credit for a particular phase that has been completed, as described in the initial Part 2 and/or subsequent amendments. We use an amendment or phase advisory determination form to submit information requested by National Park Service for an application under review and on hold, to inform NPS of a change in ownership, to amend a previously submitted Part 1, 2, or 3 application, and to request an advisory determination as to whether a completed phase of a phased rehabilitation project meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. To amend a previously submitted application, briefly describe changes to the original application and describe in further detail in attachments if necessary. Use these to respond to a condition or inadvertent discovery or any other scenario where a scope of work change is needing to be requested. Make sure that if it is in response to a condition, that the information being submitted is what is being asked for in the condition. Please note that there is no limit to the amount of amendments in order to achieve a compliant project. We would rather have a multitude of amendments that answers all the questions and concerns and have a successful project than have little to no amendments and end up with a project that doesn't meet the standards and gets denied. To request a phase advisory determination on a completed phase of a phased project, list work items completed in the phase and give the phase completion date. Continue in attachments if necessary. The phase completion date is the date that all work related to the phase was completed. If the phase completion date and the date the phase was placed into service pursuant to IRS regulations are different, the date the phase was completed is the date that must be reported on the form. The estimated rehabilitation costs of phase must be reported on the form and are defined as the phase's estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, pursuant to Section 47 of the Internal Revenue Code. IRS rules require phasing plans to be set forth before a project begins in the Part 2. See the IRS regulations for more information on meeting this requirement. NPS can issue advisory determinations only on the phases of a project that have been defined at the start of the project in the approved Part 2 application and only for work completed in that defined phase. This is amendment number 4 for the project, which addressed 3 things. 1 was the response to condition number 1, addressing the exterior wall panels and PTAC systems. 2 addressed condition number 2 concerning the entrances, and 3 responded to condition number 6 about the windows. As we see on the signature page, a brief description of the items being discussed in the amendment is provided, with a further and more detailed explanation provided on the subsequent continuation pages. Condition number 1 stated that the porcelain panels on the exterior of the building needed to be repaired rather than replaced, but if they were deteriorated beyond repair, then they would need to be fully documented and replaced in kind. Likewise, condition number 2 stated that the existing entrances were to be repaired rather than replaced, And if they were to be determined to be replaced, then they would need to be fully documented and replaced in kind. And finally, condition number 6 stated that the existing historic windows were also to be repaired rather than replaced, and if they were to be replaced, to be fully documented and replaced in kind. So let's look at those various attachments. To fulfill condition number 1 concerning the porcelain panels and the PTAC units, a document containing detailed existing conditions photographs with sample products for comparison was produced as justification for replacement and to provide evidence of an acceptable replacement. Additionally, a set of exterior elevation drawings was produced that surveyed the condition of each of the panels and documenting the damage. For condition number 2, considering the entrances to the in-building, the response was done via the write-up with no supporting documentation. In order to ensure the proposed windows meet the standards, detailed dimension drawings of both the existing and any proposed replacement windows showing them in relationship to the wall assembly must be submitted for review. The response stated that the proposed replacement windows will match the appearance, size, design, proportions, and profiles as closely as possible to the existing historic aluminum framed windows. A document further discussing the existing conditions of the existing windows was produced and provided. Additionally, a large format document of window details was drawn and submitted that compared the existing historic windows to the proposed windows side by side. The proposed windows were based on the elevations and detailed existing windows information collected on site. Once again, the SHPO reviewed the application. However, it was forwarded to MPS with their own set of conditions, which included concerns with the frame of the new PTAC units and the entrances. The National Park Service reviewed the documentation and agreed with the SHPO's recommended conditions. The consultant and applicant went back to the manufacturer to work out the frame issue and in the end created a frame that was acceptable to the Park Service, and the entrances were further addressed in subsequent amendments. All the other conditions were also addressed in subsequent amendments. So now for the part 3. Use the Part 3 form to request approval of an entire completed rehabilitation work. For a completed phase of a project, use an amendment/advisory determination form. Though this project was phased, it did not seek advisory determinations. No. Though this project was phased, it did seek advisory determinations throughout the course of the project. The final Part 3 is a combination of all phase advisories and the final um, phases that were done. The completed project may be inspected by an authorized representative of the Secretary of the Interior, i.e. SHPO or MPS, to determine if the work meets the standards for rehabilitation. The project completion date is the date that all work related to the project was completed. If the project completion date and the date the property is placed in service pursuant to IRS regulations are different, the date the project was completed is the date that must be reported on the form. Both the estimated rehabilitation costs and the total estimated costs, which includes the costs attributable to the rehabilitation, plus all other project costs, must be reported on the form. The estimated rehabilitation costs are defined as the project's estimated qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, pursuant to Section 47 of the Internal Revenue Code. If the rehabilitation project was phased or involved multiple buildings that were functionally related historically pursuant to 36 CFR Part 67, the cost reported on the form must be the total cost for the entire project. On page 2, list all additional owners with their addresses and social security numbers or taxpayer identification numbers. Continue on additional sheets as necessary. Send photographs taken after completion of the rehabilitation work showing the same views as in the Part 2. This way we can get a direct comparison between the pre-existing conditions and the after conditions to make sure it is in compliance with what was approved and the standards. A set of photographs documenting the condition of the property after the work was complete was submitted along with the Part 3 application form. The photographs sought to duplicate the Part 2 photos as much as possible. Again, accompanying these printed photographs were photo keys that depicted the site and floor plans with photo tags indicating the location of the photograph was taken and what direction the camera was pointing. During the closing of the project, a major concern arose when it was discovered that the windows in the interior courtyards of the office building were replaced with the incorrect windows. The windows did go through appropriate review and approval process, but the contractor ordered and installed the wrong windows. The property owner, consultants, SHPO, and MPS had a meeting to discuss the situation, and it was finally determined that while the subject windows themselves did not meet the standards, they were not visible from the public right-of-way and therefore minimally impactful on the project as a whole. Ultimately, it was decided that, while unfortunate, the applicant would not have to replace the windows again, as it would have cost them another $500,000 in windows, being that this was a potential $1 million issue. This is why it is so important to stay on top of contractors and to reach out to the SHPO and MPS as soon as possible if something goes awry. As such, when the SHPO issued the recommendation to the Park Service, the window issue was noted, as was the conversation about the issue, and no formal recommendation for approval or denial was made. When NPS reviewed the completed work as a whole, they accepted the overall scope of the project as meeting the standards. So when it was all said and done, the National Park Service certified the rehabilitation project on December 2nd, 2021, and the applicant was able to claim the tax credits. And they are still within their recapture period. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.